People don't change when you love them. They change when they think you have nothing left to offer. I remember hearing once, but I never believed it until I met him. My name is Olivia Carter, and I met Ethan Blackwell on a night that felt too ordinary to become important. The kind of night where nothing warns you that your life is about to split into before and after. He was standing outside a small convenience store on the edge of downtown Chicago, looking like a man the world had quietly decided to forget. Worn jacket, hands in his pockets, eyes calm in a way that made the noise around him feel distant. I did not know then that calm could be a disguise, or that silence could be something carefully constructed rather than simply lived. He asked me for help in a way that did not feel like asking at all, just a simple moment of need, like he had accepted that he did not matter enough to expect more. I remember thinking that there was something strange about how someone could look so steady while appearing to have so little. I bought him a cup of coffee that night. Nothing more, nothing dramatic, just a small human decision I would later realize was not small at all. He did not thank me in a way that felt needy or desperate, only in a way that felt observant, as if he was not just receiving kindness, but measuring it. I should have found that strange, but instead I found it comforting, like meeting someone who understood quiet the same way I did. Over the next days, I kept seeing him in places I did not expect, never intrusive, never loud, always just present enough to feel like coincidence rather than intention. He said he was between jobs, trying to rebuild something he had lost, and I believed him because people usually tell you who they are in the simplest version they can safely offer. There was something about him that made me feel like I did not have to perform, like I could just exist without being evaluated. I did not notice the way he always observed more than he spoke, or how he never seemed surprised by anything I said, as if he had already studied versions of me I had not yet become. I thought I was meeting someone who understood struggle, someone familiar with being overlooked, and in a way that was true, but I did not yet understand what kind of silence I was really standing inside. Because Ethan Blackwell was not someone life had pushed aside. He was someone life had learned to step around, and I was about to learn the difference. After that first night, I told myself it meant nothing. People cross paths in a city like Chicago all the time, and most of those crossings dissolve before they ever become memory. But Ethan Blackwell did not dissolve. He remained, not in a loud or demanding way, but in a pattern that began to repeat itself with uncomfortable precision. I would see him again outside places that felt ordinary, a bus stop on a gray morning, the edge of a small cafe where people stood waiting for their routines to begin, even a corner bookstore where time seemed to slow down just slightly. He never approached me with urgency, never tried to insert himself into my life as if he had the right to be there. Instead, he appeared like someone who had learned the exact distance at which presence becomes noticeable but not intrusive. That should have reassured me. Instead, it unsettled me in a way I could not yet explain. When we spoke, he asked simple questions. Nothing about me ever felt interrogated, but everything about me felt observed. He remembered details I did not think were important enough to remember myself, like the way I took my coffee or how I always paused before answering questions I was unsure about. I told myself it was just attention, the kind of attention people sometimes give when they are lonely or curious. But there was a consistency in him that did not match randomness. He did not behave like someone drifting through life. He behaved like someone who had already decided where he was standing and why. Still, I let myself believe the version of him that felt safest. A man between jobs. A man trying to rebuild something. A man who understood what it meant to start over with nothing. I liked that version because it made him relatable, and it made me feel less alone in my own small struggles. There were moments when I almost asked more questions, moments when something about his stillness made me want to look closer, but I stopped myself each time. People like stability in others because it feels like safety, and I had mistaken his calmness for that. One evening, I remember walking beside him for a few blocks after leaving a small diner. The street was quiet, the air cool, and the city lights reflected softly on wet pavement from earlier rain. He said very little, but I noticed how he never seemed distracted. Not by his phone, not by the passing cars, not by anything that usually pulls people away from the present moment. It was as if his attention did not wander because it did not need to. I thought I was getting to know someone who had simply been overlooked by life, someone who had learned to exist without being seen. But what I did not understand yet was that being unseen and choosing not to be seen are not the same thing. And Ethan Blackwell was not someone the world had forgotten. He was someone the world had agreed, quietly and without discussion, to avoid noticing too closely. And I was already standing too close. The morning after the quiet tension of their last conversation, the city felt different to her, as if every sound carried a hidden meaning she could not yet decode. She moved through her day with the same simple routine, unaware that every step she took was still being observed from a distance she could never see. He had not returned to his known world, not fully, not in spirit, because something about her presence had unsettled the balance he had spent years carefully controlling. She believed she was living an ordinary life, working hard, saving carefully, and trying to build something stable for herself, while he watched without revealing the truth of who he was or what he could command. The world around him had always responded to power, but with her, he had chosen silence instead, a silence that felt more dangerous than any declaration he had ever made. In his disguised role, he continued to walk the same modest paths she walked, appearing as someone unremarkable, blending into spaces where no one would ever suspect the weight of influence he carried. Yet every interaction he observed told him something new about her character, the way she treated people without expectation, the way she carried honesty even in moments when no reward could follow. She never looked for advantage in others, never adjusted her behavior based on status, and that alone made her stand out in a world built on hidden transactions. Still, she felt the strangeness of his presence without understanding it, like a thought at the edge of memory she could not fully retrieve. There were moments when she would pause in conversation, sensing that something about her environment had shifted, only to dismiss it as fatigue or coincidence. But he noticed everything, even the smallest hesitation in her expression, the way she looked out a window before making decisions, the way she carried both strength and quiet doubt at the same time. His original intention had been simple, to observe without interference, to confirm what kind of person she truly was when no one was influencing her circumstances. Yet that intention began to dissolve as he found himself caring about details that should have been irrelevant, such as whether she had eaten that day or whether her long hours were wearing her down. He reminded himself that this was only a test, a necessary step in understanding loyalty in its purest form, but the line between observation and involvement continued to blur. One evening, as she left work and walked through the dim glow of streetlights, she paused briefly at a small cafe, unaware that he was seated far enough away to remain invisible to her, but close enough to see her clearly. She chose something simple, sat alone for a few minutes, and looked out at the passing world with a calm expression that concealed more than it revealed. In that moment, he realized that the test he had designed was no longer just about her loyalty to others, but about his own ability to remain detached from what he was beginning to feel. And for the first time, he understood that the greatest risk was not exposure, but connection. The city carried the same quiet rhythm the next morning, but everything about her perception of it had begun to shift in ways she could not explain. She woke early, prepared for work, and followed her routine with careful discipline. Yet there was a lingering feeling that something unseen had begun to orbit her life. Meanwhile, he maintained the appearance of distance, continuing his role under a carefully constructed identity that allowed him to remain unnoticed. Every day, he observed her from within the same ordinary world she believed she fully understood, and every observation deepened a conflict he refused to acknowledge out loud. She remained consistent in her behavior, kind in moments where no benefit could be gained, patient in situations where others would have grown impatient, and honest even when silence might have been easier. These qualities were exactly what he had set out to measure, yet they no longer felt like data points to him. They felt personal in a way he had not anticipated, and that realization disturbed the control he had always maintained over his judgment. At the same time, she began to notice patterns that did not fit into the normal flow of her daily life. Certain people seemed to appear in the same places as her more often than chance should allow, always distant, always indirect, never interacting but never absent either. She dismissed the thought at first, convincing herself that the city was simply smaller than it seemed, but the feeling of observation continued to grow stronger. One afternoon, while she was walking home after work, she paused at a crosswalk and felt an unfamiliar sense of awareness, as if someone had aligned themselves with her movement without stepping into view. When she turned slightly, she saw nothing unusual, only the steady motion of strangers passing by, yet the sensation did not leave her. He was there, of course, positioned far enough away to remain invisible to her attention, yet close enough to read every subtle shift in her expression. He noticed how she steadied herself before continuing forward, how she adjusted her grip on her bag, and how she quietly resumed her pace, as if choosing not to let uncertainty define her actions. It was in these small moments that he understood something deeper than he had intended to learn. She was not performing kindness or strength for anyone's approval. It was simply who she was when no one was asking her to be anything else. That realization began to blur the boundary he had created between observation and involvement. The test he had designed was meant to remain controlled, contained, and emotionally neutral, yet it was no longer functioning within those limits. Instead, it had become a living experience that affected both sides in ways neither of them had anticipated. That evening, as she returned to her apartment and closed the door behind her, she leaned against it for a brief moment, allowing herself a rare pause from the steady demands of the day. On the other side of the city, he stood alone in a quiet space, staring at nothing in particular, realizing that every conclusion he had drawn so far had only brought him closer to a truth he was no longer sure he wanted to fully understand. Because what began as a test of her loyalty was slowly becoming a test of his own restraint. The days that followed carried a strange tension that neither of them acknowledged openly, yet both of them felt with increasing clarity. She continued her routine, waking early, commuting to work, and returning home with the same quiet discipline she had always maintained. But now there was an added awareness beneath her thoughts that made ordinary moments feel slightly heavier. He, on the other hand, began to experience the consequences of his own decision to remain close to her life under a hidden identity. What was meant to be a controlled observation had slowly turned into something far less predictable, because every day spent near her introduced new variables he could not easily categorize. She was consistent in ways that made her feel safe to herself, but to him, that consistency became a pattern he found increasingly difficult to ignore. There was a morning when she stopped briefly outside a small bookstore before work, not because she intended to enter, but because something about the display in the window caught her attention. He observed from a distance, noting how she took a few extra seconds to look at something simple, a moment that would have been insignificant to anyone else, but felt meaningful to him in a way he struggled to define. He reminded himself that this was still an evaluation, still a test designed to measure behavior under natural conditions, yet the language of analysis no longer fully matched what he was experiencing. Later that day, she encountered a minor inconvenience at work, nothing dramatic, just a situation that required patience and composure. She handled it without complaint, without shifting responsibility onto others, and without allowing frustration to change her tone. He learned of it indirectly through observation and brief reports from people who interacted with her environment, and instead of interpreting it as confirmation of loyalty alone, he found himself thinking about how often she absorbed pressure without making it visible. That realization stayed with him longer than expected. That evening, as she walked home, the city lights reflected softly on wet pavement after a brief rain, and she paused at an intersection longer than usual, not out of fear, but out of thoughtfulness. He was there again, positioned far enough away that she would never recognize his presence, yet close enough that he could see the subtle shifts in her expression as she considered something private. She eventually continued walking, but something in her posture had changed slightly, as if she had briefly sensed a presence she could not confirm. For a moment, he considered the possibility that the boundary between observer and observed was no longer as clear as he had believed. The test was still in motion, still technically incomplete, yet it no longer felt like something he was conducting. It felt like something that was unfolding on its own, with consequences that were beginning to extend beyond his original intention. And in that growing uncertainty, he understood that the most dangerous part was not whether she could be trusted, but whether he could continue to remain distant enough to judge her at all. The next stage of the story unfolded in a quieter, but far more complex emotional atmosphere, where neither distance nor proximity could restore the clarity that once defined their roles. She continued her life with steady discipline, waking before sunrise, preparing for work, and moving through her responsibilities with a calm consistency that made her feel grounded even when she did not fully understand the subtle shifts occurring around her. He remained within the same orbit, still operating under the same carefully constructed identity, still maintaining the appearance of a man without significance. Yet internally, he was no longer able to separate observation from awareness in the way he once had. Every interaction he witnessed, every decision she made, and every moment she endured without complaint added weight to something he had originally treated as a structured evaluation. It was no longer structured in his mind. It was evolving into something organic, unpredictable, and increasingly difficult to control. One afternoon, she encountered a situation that tested her patience in a quiet but meaningful way. A misunderstanding at her workplace required her to clarify responsibilities that were not originally hers, and instead of reacting with frustration, she chose to resolve it with calm explanation and steady focus. He observed this from a distance later, and instead of recording it as a simple data point of reliability, he found himself reconsidering the assumptions behind the entire test. Loyalty, in his original definition, had been about response under pressure, but what he was witnessing was something more consistent and more deeply rooted in character rather than circumstance. That realization introduced an uncomfortable contradiction into his thinking, because it suggested that the framework he had designed might not be sufficient to measure what he truly needed to understand. That evening, the city moved under a soft layer of rain, and she walked home with her hood lightly covering her head, her pace unhurried, her attention divided between thought and environment. He followed at a distance that ensured invisibility, yet he noticed how she occasionally slowed, as if sensing something unspoken in the space around her. There was no direct acknowledgement, no confirmation of awareness, but there was a subtle shift in her behavior that suggested intuition. Operating beneath conscious thought, he found himself questioning whether prolonged observation had created a presence that could be felt even without being seen. When she finally reached her building, she paused briefly before entering, as if allowing herself a moment of quiet reflection after a long day. In that moment, he understood that the separation between them was no longer purely physical or strategic. It had become psychological, shaped by repetition, attention, and the quiet accumulation of moments neither of them had openly addressed. What began as a controlled test had now entered a phase where control itself was no longer absolute. And in that realization, he recognized the final complication he had not accounted for, which was that the subject of observation was no longer just her behavior, but his own inability to remain unchanged by it. The balance between observation and reality continued to erode as the days moved forward, leaving both of them in a state of quiet awareness that neither could fully define. She maintained her steady rhythm of life, continuing to wake early, go to work, and return home with the same sense of personal discipline that had always guided her decisions. Yet there was now a subtle awareness within her that something about her environment felt slightly misaligned, as if the world had developed a layer she could not directly see but occasionally sensed in passing. He, meanwhile, remained committed to his original purpose in form, but not in feeling. The structure of his test was still technically intact, still based on observation without interference, but his interpretation of what he was observing had begun to shift in ways he did not openly acknowledge. Every detail he recorded about her behavior carried more emotional weight than analytical distance, and that imbalance was becoming harder to ignore with each passing day. One morning, she arrived at work slightly earlier than usual, choosing to sit alone for a few minutes before beginning her tasks. It was a small change in routine, something no one else would have noticed, but he did. He observed from afar, noting how she looked out the window without focus, as if processing thoughts that had no clear origin. There was a calmness in her expression, but also a quiet complexity that suggested she was carrying something internally without sharing it. That moment stayed with him longer than expected because it challenged his assumption that observation could remain neutral. Later that day, he reviewed the accumulated patterns of her behavior, not in a formal sense, but with a level of attention that no longer resembled detachment. He realized that every conclusion he had drawn so far had been shaped by an incomplete understanding of his own involvement. The test was no longer a one-directional process. It had become a shared psychological space, even if she was unaware of its existence. That realization introduced a tension he could not resolve through logic alone. That evening, as she walked home under a sky dimmed by late clouds, she paused briefly at a street corner, not because of external interruption, but because of an internal hesitation she did not fully understand. She looked around once, slowly, then continued forward, unaware that he was present within the same space, maintaining distance as always, yet no longer able to claim emotional distance in the same way. He noticed the hesitation not as a flaw in behavior, but as a reflection of internal awareness that might be responding to something beyond conscious recognition. It was at that point he understood that the test had crossed an invisible threshold. What was meant to measure loyalty had evolved into something far more complex, involving perception, influence, and emotional consequence. And for the first time, he considered the possibility that continuing the test in its current form might no longer reveal truth, but instead begin to create it. The final phase of this unfolding situation carried a stillness that felt heavier than any previous uncertainty, as if both lives had quietly entered a space where outcomes were no longer controlled by intention alone. She continued her routine without awareness of the invisible complexity surrounding her, maintaining the same discipline in her work, the same patience in her interactions, and the same quiet strength that had drawn his attention from the beginning. Yet something within her perception of the world had begun to subtly shift. She could not identify a cause, but she occasionally felt as though certain moments carried an unusual stillness, as if time itself briefly adjusted its pace when she entered specific spaces. He, in contrast, was no longer able to separate his original purpose from the evolving emotional weight of continued observation. The structure of his evaluation had been designed for clarity, control, and detachment, yet none of those elements remained fully intact in his current experience. Each day reinforced patterns he could no longer interpret without acknowledging his own growing involvement. One afternoon, she encountered a situation that required her to make a decision under mild pressure, not dramatic or extreme, but enough to reveal character in subtle form. A misunderstanding in communication at work created temporary confusion, and she resolved it with calm explanation and steady focus rather than frustration or avoidance. He observed this indirectly, and instead of categorizing it as confirmation of her reliability, he found himself reflecting on how consistently she chose clarity over reaction, even when no one would have held her accountable for either choice. That realization added another layer to the internal conflict he had been avoiding acknowledging directly. That evening, the weather shifted slightly cooler, and she walked home through streets softened by dim light and fading activity. She paused once near a quiet intersection, not out of fear or hesitation, but out of a brief reflective pause that seemed to come from within rather than from her surroundings. He was present at a distance, maintaining the same careful separation he had preserved throughout the entire process, yet even that separation now felt less like control and more like avoidance. He noticed how she resumed walking without urgency, carrying the same steady rhythm that defined her presence in every environment she entered. In that moment, he recognized that the original framework of the test had reached its natural limit. What had once been an attempt to measure loyalty under controlled conditions had transformed into something far more complex, where observation itself was influencing interpretation, and interpretation was influencing emotional response. There was no longer a clear distinction between evaluating her and being affected by her, and that absence of distinction created a form of uncertainty he could not resolve through logic alone. As she disappeared into the entrance of her building that night, he remained still, not moving immediately, not adjusting his position, simply observing the final trace of a pattern that no longer felt like a test, but like an unfolding truth. And in that quiet realization, he understood that continuing forward without change would no longer reveal who she was, but would instead reveal who he was becoming. In the final stretch of what had begun as a carefully controlled evaluation, both lives continued forward under the weight of a truth neither of them had fully acknowledged yet. She moved through her days with the same steady discipline, maintaining her routines, her responsibilities, and her quiet resilience in ways that appeared unchanged from the outside. Yet internally, there was a subtle shift that she could not fully define. It was not fear, and it was not certainty, but a growing sense that her life had developed layers she could not consciously access or explain. She sometimes paused briefly in ordinary moments, as if sensing meaning in details that previously felt insignificant, only to continue forward without resolution. He, on the other hand, stood at the edge of a decision he could no longer delay. The structure of observation that had once given him clarity had become unstable, not because of external interference, but because of internal contradiction. The purpose he had assigned to the test no longer aligned with the emotional reality of continuing it. Every conclusion he attempted to form was now influenced by the presence of his own awareness, which had slowly shifted from detached analysis to personal involvement. One evening, after another day of quiet observation, he found himself in a location not far from where she lived, not positioned as an evaluator, but as someone standing within the consequences of his own choices. The city around him remained unchanged, but his perception of it had altered, as if every sound and movement now carried an additional layer of meaning. He considered the original intention of the test, the idea of measuring loyalty in its purest form, free from interference or bias, and recognized that such purity no longer existed within the conditions he had created. The subject had been observed too closely for too long, under circumstances that could no longer be considered neutral. As he stood there, he realized that the final outcome he had been seeking was no longer about confirming her character. It had become about acknowledging the transformation that had taken place within himself. She, unaware of the full scope of his presence in her life, continued her evening routine with calm consistency, returning home, closing her door, and stepping into the quiet space that allowed her to reset from the world outside. Yet even there, the sense of subtle awareness lingered, not as understanding, but as instinct, a quiet recognition that something in her environment had shifted beyond what could be easily named. The distance between them, once defined by control and intention, now existed only as physical separation, while everything else had moved into a space of unresolved connection. He no longer viewed the situation as a test with a clear beginning and end. Instead, it had become a reflection of something far more complex, where observation had shaped perception, and perception had reshaped the observer. In that final realization, he understood that the truth he had been pursuing was no longer located in her actions alone, but in the irreversible change that had occurred in the act of watching itself. And for the first time, he accepted that some outcomes are not revealed by completion, but by the moment one finally chooses to stop.